As we talked this morning about the future of our department and where we're headed, I mentioned that it's important to remember our past and where we came from. Today it's my distinct honor and privilege to introduce Floyd W. Roman. Floyd joined the Richfield Police Department on September 19, 1947, serving 5 years as a patrolman, 10 years as a sergeant, and 6 years as a captain. The latter position also required serving as acting chief during the chief's absence. In addition to performing the regular tasks of the supervisory and command positions, he developed and wrote a sergeant's manual, a personal evaluation manual, a department policy and procedure manual, and worked with budgets and budget presentation. He also wrote the annual reports and helped develop a data processing system for recording statistical information about personnel, traffic, crime, and general police incidents. He appeared before City Council on numerous occasions, as well as before a number of state legislative committees. He made many public appearances speaking to service clubs, PTAs, and other groups. In 1968, Floyd left the Richfield Police Department in August and was hired by the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, which is known to us as the BCA. He developed and supervised a new traffic training program. That program, before its completion in 5 years, was to involve federal, state, and local funds in excess of $1 million. Specific responsibilities attached to the supervisory position included planning, directing, budgeting, and expanding the program. In January of 1970, there became a promotion to the position of Assistant Director of Training. This position required working with all portions of the police training program and supervising the instructional staff within the training section. Special assignments included the writing of annual reports and policy and procedural manuals. On November 4, 1970, he was promoted to the position of Assistant Superintendent of the BCA. Of the 41 years of law enforcement service, there was an accumulation of 36 years of experience in supervisory and management functions. Please welcome Floyd W. Roman.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you, sir.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
That's a lot of stuff, but I have led a pretty active life in police work, and I enjoyed every minute of it, really. Well, maybe except a few minutes, but most of it I really enjoyed it. And I enjoy being here today, talking to fellow police officers, many years, but my fellow officers, because you're all in the Richfield Police Department, as I was. We're going to show a film today that pretty well explains what happened with Fred Babcock and the pursuit of the perpetrators of his murder. But I thought, first of all, I should lay out a little, shall I call it, a little scene of how things were in those days, because they were much different than today. And in the film, you'll hear someone say, maybe myself, that one of the gangsters ran from the store, went out to Lindale, 78th and Lindale, now the freeway, then it was Highway 5, into the cornfield in Bloomington. He disappeared there. Well, Bloomington was all farm area, had no police department. They had a constable who was very difficult to get a hold of. Some other conditions that existed at that time, Richfield was mostly farms. Houses were just starting to be built, including mine on Penn Avenue. And behind me was a farm. I could hear the chickens, and there's a pig farm up on about 71st and Vincent up there. It was quite different. And maybe I could even say that we used to get called down to Kramer's farm. This is a farm that was located on the Richfield side of Old Highway 5, and their grazing area for their cattle was Southtown. So we'd have to go down there and hold up the traffic while the cows went by in the spring and the fall. Another incident that would kind of indicate the times. I used to park, when I want to take a little rest, I'd park on the gravel road, which is now 35W, down by Wood Lake. And Wood Lake was a lake. And I look in the distance and I see this plane coming with pontoons on it. And I think, geez, that guy isn't going to land here, is he, in that little lake? Sure enough, he comes, he lands on Wood Lake. And I don't know if he saw me or what, but he taxied back and took off right away. Well, that's the way things were in those days. And so you can kind of relate to that when you see the film. One other thing I should bring up before the film is the police department itself. And I look at this building now, and I look at it in awe. When I put in my when I wanted to put in my application in 1947, I called and they said, you come over to the Village Hall at 67th and Portland and pick up an application. So I come over here, I don't see no city hall. I see a house next to a fire station. And then I see a sign that says Village Hall. Well, I go up to the door of this house, and I don't know whether I should knock or what, but I just walked in. And inside, there were no walls. It was just a hall. And there was one person sitting over there, who I later discovered was a fire chief. Well, at any rate, I got my application and so on and so forth. At that time, when I did get on, there were 5 officers. 4 patrol officers and the chief. The chief worked days all the time, and the officers had to work the 4 to 12 and the 12 to 8 in the morning. Now, if you know anything about scheduling, you know how can they do that, working 2 at a time in one squad car. Well, they did have a part-time police officer who helped out, and of course they put in long hours themselves, and almost a full week sometimes. So they complained during this period of near the end of the war, and the village council at that time said, well, when these young fellows come back, when these vets come back, we'll hire somebody to make things better for you. Well, I was one of those, and 3 of us were hired at the same time. In this time of the 5 officers, one of them quit, so of the 3 of us, one went and took his place, and the 2 of us were there to relieve the time that these officers put in and work out the shifts better than they were. But for about a year, I still worked 6 days a week. And so we started to complain about that, and then they decided, okay, we'll get you on a 5-day week like everybody else in the other suburbs in Minneapolis and so on. Well, that's when Fred Babcock was hired. Now, there was a little problem with hiring him. The chief called me in and he says, geez, we got a good applicant here, but he owns the Frenchman's. And he didn't know, and I wondered too, how's that going to go over with the public? We hire a guy that owns well, not a bar, a tavern more. But his qualifications were so good, and we decided, at that time probation was for 6 months, that part of the agreement of his hiring was that he'd have to sell that place, absent himself from that business altogether, even before he sold it. So the only time he could really go over there was when he got called there on a police matter. He got a manager who ran the place for him, and any business would be conducted at Fred's house, which was directly across 66th Street from the Frenchman's, and you're acquainted with that, I'm sure. So with that kind of background, I think we can show this tape here.
It was a summer evening, although it was later in the night than this, but it was June 4th, 1949, when one of the most tragic events in the history of the city of Richfield occurred. Welcome to a special edition of Out and About in Richfield. We're going to tell the story on this particular show of the tragic shooting of Officer Fred Babcock. As I said, it was June 4th, 1949. It was about 2 a.m. in the morning, somewhere around there, when a resident living across the street on Garfield Avenue looked out and saw that there was activity occurring at the back of what was then the National Tea Store, which was located basically at on the 7600 block of Lindale Avenue. and of course Garfield backs onto Lyndale. The resident called the police. 2 officers are dispatched, Officer Babcock and Officer Poulter. They were in a squad car about 68th and Lyndale. Arrived on the scene. Poulter went out of the car to go walk through the yards to get up on National T to go check out the back door. Officer Babcock was with the police car, rolled it up here on Garfield Avenue, and got the drop on the getaway car. Within minutes of that happening, there were gunshots, and Officer Babcock lay in the street, basically right here in the boulevard area, mortally wounded, and died shortly thereafter.
And what's so fascinating about this tragic story in the history of Richfield is that we have still with us today a Richfield resident, a police officer who responded to this incident, Floyd Roman. And Floyd is going to really take us through the details of that night and then the subsequent incredible chase that went on to apprehend the criminals that were a part of that tragic night in Richfield back in June 1949, right?
Right.
So
let's take it away and hear the story.
yeah, absolutely.
Well, we're back now with Floyd Roman. Floyd was a police officer with the city of Richfield back in 1949 when the shooting of Officer Fred Babcock occurred. Floyd started with the police force in about June of 1947, I believe.
47.
And then I think in about 1968, you went with the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension.
That's right.
My interest in this story came when I found an old copy of this front page detective magazine from October of 1949. And one of the major articles in here was all about, it was called 100 Hours of Hell, the story of the shooting of Richfield officer Fred Babcock, and then the subsequent 5-state chase and kidnapping and everything that occurred. And you know, I have been associated with the city for nearly 30 years, and I knew of the shooting of Fred Babcock, and I see his picture over in the police department, but I never realized the complexity of the story. But I think we're so fortunate to be able to retell the story with somebody who was actually there at the time this occurred. And so I guess what I'm going to do is, Pam and I would like you to just tell us a little bit about what happened that night, June 4th, 1949, when Fred Babcock was shot.
Well, I remember I was in bed, of course. This occurred shortly after midnight in the early morning of June 4th. And I received a call from the chief of police that Fred Babcock had been killed by some burglars and to get over to the station as soon as possible. The other officers were similarly called that were off duty. I was paired up with another officer, and the other officers were also paired up. I went immediately to the scene at 76 in Lyndale, observed what was going on there, and got the information that I needed. And I learned at that time that the details of the shooting and so on. It seemed that Fred and Lee Poulter received a call that there was a burglary going on, and it was being observed by a family in a home. Their last name was Reynolds, and they were keeping an eye on what was going on. So Lee Poulter and Fred Babcock proceeded to the scene with the idea that Lee was going to be dropped off at the corner of 76 and Garfield, and Fred would pull up behind the suspect's car.
Can I just stop for a second? Now, we look at 76th and Lyndale right now, and of course there's the large Twin City Christian home facility there. Back in those days, obviously Richfield in 1949 was a whole lot different. Lyndale was a main thoroughfare. You went across the bridge basically into cornfields that were in Bloomington. The National Tea Store, which was one of the major grocery stores in town at that time, was located kind of on the corner of 76th and Lyndale. And then there were kind of the south side of that block, sort of.
Yes, that's true.
And then the homes, like the Reynolds, they were living at, I think it was 7620 Garfield now.
yes.
That of course, that block doesn't exist anymore. It's part of two developments. But so when they went down to the scene, as you said, they were going to somewhere on that block of Garfield, looking at the back of what was then the National Tea Store.
Yes, Reynolds could see the back of the back door of the National Tea. They could also see, of course, the car in front of their place, and the lookout person who was stationed right next to their house almost.
Did they see that lookout person or at
Yes,
the time?
yeah.
Okay.
Oh, they did. Okay.
And so at any rate, the plan was to drop Lee Poulter off at the intersection where he would run down to that back door and try to apprehend the person breaking in there. Meanwhile, Fred would pull up behind the car, not knowing who was in it or how many people, and get them out of the car. Well, as Lee was proceeding down there, Fred had pulled up behind the car, got out, hid behind the car door and the car itself, pointed his gun at the suspect car, yelling for those people to get out. And instead, there was fire back, several of them striking Fred, and I learning later that the first bullet is the one that really killed him. But it hit him with such force that it threw his gun that he had in his hand over the squad car to land on the boulevard to the right side. Poulter, hearing all the shooting, and the suspect down at the store, they panicked. Well, not panicked, the suspect panicked, but Poulter came running back up to see what happened. The suspect started running back up also to that car. Well, the car pulls out, leaving the suspect behind. So he goes back down to Lindale Avenue and takes off towards Bloomington.
Okay.
Meanwhile, Lee finds out what happened and called the ambulance, and it was too late for any.
I mean, Fred basically
He was
died
killed
right there at the
instantly,
scene.
yeah.
You
And
said
he had been how long on the force
Yeah.
at that time?
He started 6 months after probably 16 months.
And he was how old at the time that he was killed?
He was 26.
26.
you said, Floyd, that he was shot with such impact. They found out later what he was shot with was a .30-30 rifle.
That had been stolen in a burglary earlier by the same people.
One of the shots went through the, I understand, through the radiator of the police car.
Yeah.
One shot actually severed his jugular vein. And a .30-30 is, I mean, a .30-30, that's a high caliber rifle to be shot with. I can understand why it would cause such trauma. And actually, as the cars were speeding off, I understand that Lee Poulter was shot at the car as it was leaving, and that's one of the reasons they sped off so fast. Leaving, actually, there were 4 people involved. There were the 2 people in the car, which were brothers, right? There were Carl Bistrom and Arthur Bistrom.
Right.
They were in the car. The man who started running off down towards the Bloomington cornfields, that was Gustav Johnson, is that correct?
That's right.
And there was another man who was in the store at the time, I think, unless I have that wrong, named Hartman.
Yeah, he was more or less the lookout man.
Okay.
He was with the Bistroms.
He was with the
stayed up there at the top of the.
Okay.
It's kind of a hill going down.
But how did he get away from that scene?
Well, he jumped back in the car. He was
jumped in
so
the
close
car.
to it. Yeah.
Okay.
And who actually did the shooting out of this, group of
Carl, the younger brother of the.
Carl
Arthur,
Bistrom
yeah.
actually fired the shot. So those 3 got away in the car,
Right.
leaving Gustav
Yeah.
running
On his own.
Running on foot.
running south towards Bloomington.
Yeah, he didn't go across the Lindale Bridge. He went across Old Highway 5, which is now 494.
Okay.
And Bloomington was primarily farmland out there. Well, Richfield was too for a large part of it. But he disappeared into the cornfield in Bloomington.
And so then the chase was on, I assume.
Well, now I'm on the scene after this happens, and these other officers. And the Minneapolis police sent out one of their key investigators. The Hennepin County Sheriff sent out 2 of their key investigators, and Edina and some of the other communities joined in trying to find this person, but the corn was fairly tall and it was dark. We had no idea where he was. And then we had heard of these bloodhounds down in La Crosse, Wisconsin, that they had helped other police departments. So a call was made to this person down there, the owner of the dogs, and he said, "Oh man, it's going to take me a couple hours to get up there." Well, that's all right. We didn't care. So we kind of waited around while some of the cars were out patrolling looking for this person. But in all that cornfield and farm area out there is pretty difficult. Well, the dogs finally arrived, 2 of them, with the owner. And I had never seen bloodhounds work before, and I always had some doubt about it, their ability to do what they said they'd do. Well, Gustav had dropped his glove, and of course the crowbar that he was using to try to get in the door. The dogs got a sniff of that glove, and off they went. I mean, they don't walk, they run. And he's got them on leashes, and he's running after him. And the last I remember seeing him, he's going into a cornfield on the other side of the highway. So we go out, or we started to go out, my partner and I think it was Russ Peterson, to maybe get ahead of him to see, or at least keep eye on him if he goes across the street, which there weren't too many of in Bloomington at that time. Then we get a call, or we hear a call that the Minneapolis detective and the 2 Hennepin County deputies who were in the same car had apprehended Gustav. And it was out on, we said, we'll be right out there. So we went out Lyndale, and some reports in the paper, I remember, said that it was on Lyndale, but I remember distinctly driving up to, it was either 88th or 90th Street, and all those side streets were gravel at that time. But I remember going on a gravel street to the right of Lyndale going south, and meeting their car there, and they had Gustav in the back seat. And I remember one of the officers in the car, he says, "You see that officer standing out there pointing to me?" He said, he worked with Fred. He's a buddy of his. You want to get out and talk to him? Well, but anyway, Gustav was wet almost up to his neck because of the early morning dew on the corn. And very meek, sitting back there like this.
Floyd, the actual shooting happened about roughly 2:15, 2:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
It was Friday night, early Saturday morning of June 4th. So about different reports put it around 2:15, 2:30. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't recall that.
So the time that that Gustav Johnson was apprehended probably was what, in the wee early morning
it was getting,
hours? Starting to get light?
Yeah.
Okay. And this is all still happening early Saturday morning, June 4th, 1949.
Right. Now, another thing we had to think of at the time is Mrs. Babcock knew nothing of this. And somebody had to get over there and notify her before she'd hear on the radio or something in the morning. So Lee Polder and I got that assignment.
Oh.
And it was not an easy thing to do.
Oh.
I'm sure not.
And they had 2 small children?
2
right?
small children.
And so you had to go over and actually share that news with her.
Of course, she broke down.
Yeah. Floyd, we'll talk in a second about what happened to the other 3, but let's go back to Fred Babcock for a minute. Mm-hmm. Fred Babcock joins the force the same year you do, 1947.
About 6 months later.
6
so
months.
It was 48 when he came.
Actually 48?
Yeah.
Okay. He was a war veteran.
Yeah,
fought on Tarawa. He was a Marine, wasn't he?
I knew he had over 3 years, and a lot of that time was in the South Pacific.
Right.
He had medals you wouldn't believe.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So it was so ironic that here you have a man who was fought on Tarawa and in the South Pacific, makes it through 3 years in the World War II, comes back to Richfield and ends up getting ambushed. In his first year and a half.
Town.
At that time.
and Barnum
how big was the police department at that time?
Well,
Like
there was
maybe.
with our addition, there was a chief and 7 people.
7 people.
Yeah.
A lot of farm fields, and
Yeah.
I bet this is something that, you would just never comprehend or really.
Well,
how often
was
would
a
something
shock.
like this happen that you'd have a gang come into town and
Right.
actually shoot an officer?
Well, And the two officers, again, Lee Poulter and Fred Babcock, those were the only two officers on duty for the whole city that night.
That's the way it was normally.
Okay.
Two officers in one squad car to handle all of Richfield.
So then Gustafson, he's in custody. Now the authorities know who else is involved in this. The other three, apparently they make a small stop at St. Paul, where they're based out of St. Paul, I believe.
Yeah,
The Bistroms and Hartman, and then they take off on their chase.
Right.
And they head up towards North Dakota.
That's right.
And they go to North Dakota, and then what happens?
Well, the next morning, this would be on the 5th, a Mandan police officer stops him, Mandan, North Dakota. He's working alone, and several residents saw him stop this car, and they thought it was a traffic stop. Well, he goes up to the car, and they point their guns at him and kidnap him, take the squad car, and take off from there. And they went about 500 miles, I believe, in that squad car, and they had the officer drive about 100 of those 500 miles.
From North Dakota
From Mandan
through
down into South
Dakota.
So that's really a sign of desperation when you're willing to, kidnap another officer, take a squad, head on this incredible chase.
Well,
They're trying to elude I'm sure we're trying to track them down very fervently.
to hide themselves, so to speak, from being recognized, they tore off the red lights, tore off the antenna. And I should mention that the dispatcher up there heard Officer Sen, who was the officer kidnapped, call in for help. And later on, a couple of voices came on, strange voices to the dispatcher that said, "Forget the last call, the situation is well in hand."
All right.
So anyway, then down to South Dakota they went. They finally, a roadblock was set up in McIntosh, South Dakota, but they went right through that, kept going. Then, either because the engine of the squad car burned out, so to speak, because of their crazy driving, they kidnapped a young 16-year-old boy in his car who was coming home from a date or something, and they took him, they dropped him off later on, but they proceeded on, and they kidnapped some other people to change cars. There was a total of 5 stolen cars in this chase.
And even, didn't they take a family hostage or something in their home for a while?
Well, that's where this developed into a big operation police-wise. There at one time were 11 planes flying around looking for these suspects. One of these planes evidently flew over the car that they were in. So they want to hide. They pull into this farmyard under the trees. They go in, and then this thing you referred to happened. It was the wife I think was 20-some years old, the husband not much older. A couple of farmers. The husband was out at the field at the time. They come into the house, take over, and they stayed there for a while, had coffee, and Art Bistrom decides this is enough for him. So he tells the others to take off, he's staying, he's going to give up. He held the gun on the husband comes back, he was working out in the field. He comes back, so they're all being held there by him. He held them for a couple hours to let his friends get a good head start.
Sure.
Then he turned the gun over to the farm couple and told them to call the sheriff.
And I think what had happened also in that meantime, now the older one, Arthur Bistrom, who was about 37, 38 years old.
37.
Okay. He was married, and apparently his wife had gone on the radio.
Yes, that's
and
true.
and really was imploring her husband to give himself up. She'd rather have him serve some time in prison than be shot. And that, I think, it was part of the decision that Art made in terms of deciding to give himself up.
Supposedly he made the statement, "I don't go for the violence." See, a burglar normally is not a murderer.
It's a different.
They're in their own setting, so to
Yes.
speak. So he had enough.
So things had just gotten way out of control
Yeah.
as far as he was concerned. So his younger brother Carl and then this Hartman
Were
they
together.
were the one they took off.
You're right.
So they were still on the loose trying to get away.
Yes, they proceeded down into Nebraska now. In fact, Nebraska, they were in Nebraska. That's where that farm was where Arthur gave up. But they proceeded on, and there had been a tremendous rainstorm. And they come to this bridge, which was washed out over a creek. Down they went into the creek, were badly injured. So Hartman, dazed, was able to walk up to a farmhouse and ask for help. Well, the farmer there, he gets a neighbor, and they put a shotgun in the car. And they drive down to the scene, and they see two people in there. Now, this is strange. See, there were only two left. Well, Hartman's up at the house. So it was later found out that the second person in the car was a hitchhiker that they picked up on the way. Now, why they would pick up a hitchhiker, I have no idea.
They were making a lot of good decisions anyway,
They
but
used to be doing everything in threes. I don't know.
But they were both badly, they were bleeding.
And you have
dazed.
pictures of that in here, I believe,
Yeah.
as far as pictures of
That was-
when they were captured and they were injured from the
From
car
the
going
hospital,
down into the...
yeah, right.
Uh-huh.
So the farmer happened to be the brother of the sheriff. So he calls the sheriff, and of course that's the end of the story as far as the flight. There's
And that's-
prosecution came up later on.
and actually that all happened in Kansas, I think.
Well,
Or was it-
Marysville, Nebraska, which is right on
On the Kansas border?
border.
Okay.
Yeah.
All
But
right.
it's very, they liken it, I think, in that detective magazine to sort of the Jesse James kind of, when Jesse James came riding into Minnesota, and then he took off on this same kind of 5-state tear.
To get back to
That
Missouri.
This really was kind of the modern day, same kind of scenario.
Well, it was a big event because it got nationwide attention, and I remember later on, after all this was over, that we got contributions when there was a request for money for the family. Fred had just given up his GI insurance, so they had nothing. And then several things happened, which we can talk about a little bit later. But
Sure.
I know money came in from as far as California and Florida for the cause of the family. Of course, there was Fred's funeral, and that was kind of touching too. The pallbearers were myself and other Richfield officers. And I remember as we came out of the funeral was conducted down at Waylander Quist on I think it's 23rd and DuPont, because we had no funeral homes out here, Well, then there was the burial, of course, as you see with the Marine firing squad. And about 10 days after the murder, the village then decided we should have a Fred Babcock Day to help the family, to raise some money for him. Oh, and I should say that all the merchants closed their stores during the funeral that afternoon. From noon till 3:30, they were closed in respect to him. Well, there were a number of events that took place to raise money. The grocery stores and other stores, they gave part of their proceeds from that day to the Fred Babcock family. We had an entertainer who lived in Richfield, who later became a councilman here. He was called Slim Jim, but his real name was Ernest Iverson. And he was a country western radio type, and he played at some establishments in Minneapolis and around. And he had connections, of course, with a lot of people in entertainment. The Ink Spots happened to be in town at the time, and he asked them if they would come out to perform in a fundraising thing for Fred's family. And they agreed, and they came out and did it without charge. So eventually, all of this ended up in raising almost $10,000 for Fred's family, which at that time was quite a bit of money.
Yeah.
Right.
And the same as the GI insurance, it was $10,000. And I had dropped mine just like Fred did too, so we were all kind of in the same boat at that time.
Right. Well, you know, it is a touching story when you talk about what the community did then to show their appreciation and to help the family of Officer Babcock. I think most people know that the Richfield VFW post was, the Fred Babcock VFW post was named after, of course, after Officer Babcock. But there's another piece of the story that's interesting, and of course it involves you and the Babcock family. Now, after this event, a couple years after, I believe, Fred had a younger brother.
That's right.
And he joined the Richfield Police Force.
That's right.
And he became your partner.
Yeah, he was one of my partners.
One of your partners. Well, for the many, I know the 20-some years you were here, but he was a partner of yours.
That's right.
And he was a partner of yours at the time that another very significant event happened in Richfield, and I'm talking about July 1951. And that's a topic for another show. We're going to bring Floyd back to talk about the time that he was partnered up with Fred Babcock's brother when a tornado ran through Richfield in July of 1951. So folks, you're going to have to wait for that story, but it'll be coming up soon. An interesting story, I'm sure, and we have here a repository of some just amazing history in the city of Richfield, and we're going to get those shows together and get that out to you so you can see it during our 100th anniversary year. So, thank you, Floyd. It was a pleasure talking to you about this. I think that it is so important that that people in Richfield have this history to look at, because, you know, even with all the years that I've spent at Richfield, I had no idea of the complexity of the Fred Babcock event and what took place, and it's something that's got to be preserved for Richfield history. So we're so fortunate to have you tell the story. So, until we see you next time on Out and About in Richfield, take care.
Well, that's a Fred Babcock story, and it did include almost everything that transpired during that whole event. Do you have any questions, or if not, I would like to add this. And I should say that at that time too, and I should have said it at the beginning, we changed shifts every 2 weeks, and we changed partners every 2 weeks. So all of us at that time had worked with Fred along the way someplace. Fred and I, and his wife and my wife, we went to movies together, so he was kind of someone special to me and my wife. Towards the end of the film, it said that's the end of the Fred Babcock story. Not quite. Every one of you, each one of you, is a part of that story too. And I'll tell you why. About 2 or 3 months ago, my daughter and son discovered or learned about the memorial, the Veterans Memorial over at Veterans Park. And through the process of getting me signed up, and by the way, a fellow is writing a book about this, he told me that Fred's name was not on that memorial. And I thought, oh my God, a veteran in the South Pacific and a police officer in Richfield, he gave his life for the community, and his name's not on there. Well, I tried different places to get, it cost $400. I tried different places, a couple of them, and then someone suggested I contact your union, which I did. I got a hold of Mike. And I subsequently learned there was no problem. Everybody voted for that $400 to put his name on there. So coincidentally, as it ends up, his name and my name are going to be next to each other. And that's the end of the Babcock story. And so I know that if Fred was here, he'd thank you very much, and I certainly do. Thank you.